Hello, welcome to Art Talk. I'm Jim Tripp, your host today, and in the spirit of art, today we're going to cover a group of artists from the West Coast. This film is hosted by Peter Sellars, and it's called Stretching the Canvas. I think you'll enjoy the show. These artists are on the cutting edge of what's happening in California right now. Good luck.
Hello. For the next hour, you're going to see some art. This art comes from Southern California, which is one of the hot spots in the contemporary art world. Why? Well, that's because some very interesting artists happen to be living there and working there right now. Most of them are not household names, although needless to say, after this program, that will change. This video is made in collaboration with 4 different museums: the Laguna Art Museum, the La Jolla Museum of Contemporary Art, the Santa Monica Museum of Art, and the White Art Gallery at UCLA. These videos collectively were funded by 180 families in Southern California who call themselves the Fellows of Contemporary Art and pay for exhibitions, catalogs, and videos so that we can talk about art and it gets out there, which is where it belongs. Out there, of course, is where most of the artists are pushing it, and this program is called Stretching the Canvas. Lita Albuquerque is a citizen of the world. She creates an art of deserts, mountains, horizons, and night skies. It's a blazing, sheer, poetic elemental force.
I'd love to see a place where the world is truly organized to nurture creativity. In our culture, we tend to revere the mental or the visual only, not all the other senses. I would love to see the society organized where we're really developing all of our senses. There's so much wealth in each one of us, and because of how things are structured, we're not using it. One day I was walking up in the hills, and I was very aware of the verticality of my body. I was taking dance at the time, and that the verticality of it against the horizon line formed a cross. And I thought, wow, that's how symbols are formed. It's through the interrelationship of man and the environment. I think of the body as a perceptual system, and my particular system is definitely one who experiences things phenomenologically, meaning that my experience is really through the senses. And so that really anywhere that I go, I'm very, very influenced by what's around me. It's almost like a receptor. Now, as I'm developing more and more as an individual, it's getting clear what it is that I do want to say, but it's also on that intuitive level, where it's known but not totally known, and so I'm totally trusting the intuitive, and I'm putting that forth. every single body of work that I've done is almost like a book. Every single exhibition I've done is like a book. Each one really tells a story. I love the way my work has developed, actually. It's fascinating to me. I always feel in awe of what has occurred, because it's occurred in such a, in a way, in a very natural level, and it's always followed my life. My life and my work has been very interrelated. As she drew the curtains of night over the earth, he whispered in her ear, "The way is through the mirror. The way to the boat is through the mirror." "Where can I find it?" she asked. He knew that for now she would never be able to find it. He would have to show it to her. He pulled the hair back from her face and held the mirror for her as he said, "Look, beauty, look in there." She looked in there, but could not see herself. All she saw were tears that filled the mirror that became the sea. My role, I think, is to access the invisible, to access the hidden. I do things 2-3 hours a day that accesses the unconscious, let's say. It's not really just the unconscious, though. It's a whole other realm. And so I put myself through these different practices where I'm almost living in that realm most of the time. And so that then it just kind of flows through, and the work just flows out and becomes what that other realm is. The very first outdoor piece that I did came from realizing how symbols come about, and that it's through the interrelationship of man and his environment. The first piece that I did was this blue line extending all the way out to the end of the bluff, but it looked like it was going all the way out to the horizon line. I've always had a real relationship to the horizon line. Gold. Transformational. It's very powerful. Really, it's the color of the soul. Being an artist, you're constantly nurturing, you're constantly mothering, you're constantly loving. It's really an act of love, constantly, and you're putting it out, and you're constantly birthing, right? And then, of course, you've got children who are demanding the same kind of attention, and it's tough. It's a real tough road, actually, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, having children has totally altered my life in such a deep way, and meaningful way. I can't imagine not having them. I believe that the way we conceive time has really nothing to do with the reality. My work comes out of the experience of living. Essentially, I feel my purpose is to make art that is transformative. I'd like to be, by the end of my life, truly expressed.
Judd Fine's art is really hard to talk about. It's actually also hard to look at. It's an art of confusion, of contradictions, of strange historical significance, and somehow inexplicable conundrums. It's an art of mixed media, mixed cultures, mixed metaphors, and very mixed signals.
In time, I began to see art simply as a study of creativity, you know, in a very scientific way. And its intrigue is that it's constantly primary, that as a study, it's always a primary experience and not a secondary experience. You know, in later work, I began to see that one of the things that's most interesting about artists, I suppose, is an absolutely secondary artifact. All artworks are completely eclectic. They're always referential to artworks that preceded them. But at the same time, by definition, they're primary acts. They never existed before. So they become a tertiary act, in a sense, where a secondary act becomes primary. All analogies are false, including this one. If this one is, in fact, an analogy is, by definition, a secondary artifact or a secondary piece of information, then all analogies are false. When I decided to be an artist, I was in history. I was spending a lot of time in the library trying to prove this obscure point and realized that all the information I gathered, I could prove the other side. I mean, the whole thing, I just decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life coming up with a hypothesis and then spending 5 or 6 years trying to prove it. So I thought I should get into something, I should get into an area where I could come up with hypothecations and not have to prove them, just let force of conviction do it. The basic inclinations were laid out in the beginning, almost in the decision to be an artist in the first place, and just the working process over 20 years has made everything denser and, on the surface at least, more complex. I think that the ideas are really simple, but they're exampled has just become more multifarious as I've made more and more connections, and it's just a dying process. There's a strong temporal quality to the work. I never saw myself as predicting the future or constructing where we were going. The work's really about just trying to betray where we're at right now. The world's more complicated, it's much harder, and the art world is only a reflection of the general world. So it's much harder to determine things like moral values, ethical values, informational importance within the myriad of information one encounters. There isn't a meaning to be got from the work. If you get anything, it's the premises that lead to meaning. That happened with the polls, and again, this is over time. Hindsight's great in looking back on it. They just continued to be done. They continued to define their context. They became narrower and narrower in terms of what they could be, and they just took on more and more ideas. I've always seen them as drawings. I think if, in a really absurdly simplistic way, if you look at Western art, sculpture is about being anthropomorphic and vertical. In a sense, it's a celebration of our existence on the earth, which is anthropomorphic and vertical, and also it's a celebration of our dominance in a physical way. Painting, on the other hand, seems to reflect whatever our idea of the way our brain sees images is, which is basically flat, generally black and white pictures. Therefore, we project this rectilinear plane out onto an artificial surface. No vertical planes exist in nature except in rare instances in the mountains, say. So painting becomes a celebration of the way our mind works or sees images, I think. I was born in California in 1944, on the beach, in basically a sort of rural, at that time, scene adjacent to L.A. The thing that was unique about California then was that it virtually didn't have a class structure. There were a few very rich people, and there were a whole lot of people that were essentially disfranchised, essentially coming here for an opportunity, which means you didn't have one where you came from. When I went to graduate school, I decided to go back east because I'd never really been back there, and I thought, this is a chance to do it. So I went back to Cornell, and I was amazed at the class structure. And later, in traveling in England, in Europe, I saw the same class structure, and on a much deeper kind of level. And I realized that California, and my background, was unique in that I grew up without a sense of higher and lower classes. And that, to me, is sort of in a purist way, and perhaps I'm being absurd because I'm a white male, 40 years old, and I'm sure a Chicano or a black person would tell you exactly the opposite story about California in the early 50s. But at any rate, it seemed to me to be fairly democratic, especially compared to the East Coast. In coming to art, the way I came to it, sort of as a very conscious decision, not based on any sense that I was born to be one. I realized it was a real conscious choice. It occurred in my early 20s, and anyone could do it. So I never had an idea that I was born to be an artist, that I was gifted, that I had particular talent for doing what I was doing. And it's been real critical to me to continue to promote that democratic idea, that anyone can be an artist if they want to. And at the same time, art should speak to the general population, but not in a pandering way, in a complicity. It should call from them the highest they can go to, and it should continue to offer heights that they can't reach, but could maybe over time. That the tools that an artist deals with, or any creative person, is their ability to make connections. And their tools, then, are the way they work. And there's a lot of components to the way one works. The way you physically process information, the way you temporally process information, the way you reflect on information, the kinds of dream structures you get, intuitive pops that happen in your brain at the oddest times. And a person that's functioning in the area that deals with exampled progression, which we could call creativity, has to use those as their tools. You could be engaged in the most serious subject, and you're sitting there thinking or writing or working or whatever, and you get an idea. Oftentimes you'll have a smile on your face. I mean, there'll just be this delight, The light bulb goes on, you go wham, and you've got this idea. And it could be, totally ugly, but there's this humor to the connection, and I think that humor itself is based on connections, on taking two things and making a connection that never hit somebody before, and they hear the joke and they laugh. And it seems to me that the creative process is essentially humorous. And at the same time, it's horrendous. I would say, and I even teach this as a teacher, that going into art's not something that you want to take lightly. It's like having kids. I mean, if you have a child, you have the child for life. You can be 95 and the child can be 75 and it's still your kid. You'll still act to you like your dad, you know. It's not going to go away. So people may have rash decisions, they do something for whatever reasons, and you've got this thing that's there forever. In a sense, once you become an artist, it's there forever. 99% of the artists fail by the definition of what being an artist is. If we consider that only half a dozen artists of any particular generation are going to be important 300 years later, that means that almost every artist that's functioning is by nature a failure. And in a sense, there's that dichotomy in the creative field. Or on one hand, it's just a horrid existence, you know, absolutely the worst. And on the other hand, it's one of the highest callings one as a human could possibly perform, and therefore you can't not do it.
Betty and Allison Saar are mother and daughter. They're also each artists. They talk to each other through their art and through their lives. The art has an intense and very beautiful connection, but it also speaks to differences of women across two generations. Nonetheless, what they have in common is a sense of the rural inside the urban. A strange, perfect world of symbols, totems, nails, and life and death.
I find something and I get an idea for a piece of art. Urban archaeology growing up, and I think that my work reflects that a lot now. Mix cultures together, mix religions together, mix racial groups together. There's a duality to everyone, and that there's two sides to everything. Allison was the most stubborn of the daughters and the messiest. I kind of tried to resist becoming an artist simply because my mother was who she was. I'd like to communicate, not so much ideas or thoughts, but feelings. There must be something really specific inside of me that I am trying to eke out. The pathway to being an artist probably started when I was a child and finding objects, always attracted to found treasure. And then growing up, not in Watts itself, but living a certain part of the time with my paternal grandmother who lived in Watts, and seeing the Watts Towers grow up, because it was this really special, magical, mysterious thing. So mystery is also a part of my work. Found objects and looking for things along the railroad tracks or in the backyard, so finding treasure is a part of my art. What I would like for my art to do ideally is to stimulate some kind of feeling on the part of the viewer. I think that's one of the reasons why I became really interested in installation art, because the viewer can walk into the space and become part of it. And I try to select materials or images that stir up some sort of emotion. Three daughters, and each one are really, really different. Allison was the most stubborn of the daughters and the messiest. So already she was individualistic in her own bed. And also being the middle child, where the baby got a lot of attention, or the eldest daughter was already set. You know, she was maybe the most rebellious when she was a student at Otis and just becoming an artist, or really becoming more decisive in her decision to make art, I would make suggestions and she would say, no, I see it this way. And, you know, once I saw the results, and I just knew that she had her own vision.
I mean, it's always a shame in a gallery or museum situation that people can't touch the works, because at home, you know, I'm constantly fondling them, and that the tactile and hands-on element is really important to me. So I think that came a lot out of influence with working with my father, and then with my mother, I think the idea of spirit and kind of the non-Western element also, and encompassing all aspects of cultures and religions, and that everything is kind of equally as important, that you have to respect all of those things. And I've always been kind of intrigued with the idea of those two sides to us, and that there's this kind of wild animal self to every person, and that can be your anger or your passion. And then there's also this very civilized self, which allows you to interact with other people. And for some reason, that's fascinated me all along. I think it was interesting, when I was in high school, when my mother was first, I think that she got her first National Endowment grant when I was a senior or a junior in high school. And you know, I was going into my art class, and all anyone could talk about was, oh, God, your mother this, your mother that. And it really got me furious, because no one was ever looking at my work. And I think at that point, I decided I wasn't going to be an artist, and that I was very much interested in non-Western art history and studying that and wanting to write about that. And then it just turned out, I found out when I got my thesis back, that I wasn't that good a writer after all. And so I decided to just go ahead and pursue the art end of it, because it was much easier to speak in images and visuals than it was with words for me. It came to a point where I had to throw away my art education and make this kind of stand to go off on my own. And so maybe a year after that was when I moved to New York.
We didn't see each other that often. We thought it would be interesting to have a collaborative show that would express a mother and daughter, or two women that were artists in the same family, living on the East Coast, and how her work changed, being on the East Coast, and mine being on the West Coast. The way it's worked out for us to open the new decade really seemed special to both of us.
Sometimes the messages will get twisted and turn and mean different things to different people. But I like that about it, and that people, half of the piece is what people bring to it, what the viewers bring to it, and kind of what they get out of them.
Art comes in trends and waves, and what's in the vogue and what's selling. And I think if you are true to yourself and whatever your concerns are, then that would be your obligation.
I don't think that art should be forced on somebody.
A man saw my work and he says, I really like your work.
I'm like speaking Babylonian out there or something. They're like, you know, what is she talking about? What is this about?
Don't ask that question again, though.
If you treat everyone right, everything's going to be fine.
Live and let live, different strokes for different folks.
It'd be nice if people came, saw the show, and saw that we were very different and yet very similar.
I find something and I get an idea for a piece of art.
Urban archaeology growing up, and I think that my work reflects that a lot now.
Mix cultures together, mix religions together, mix racial groups together.
There's a duality to everyone, and that there's two sides to everything.
I'd love to see a place where the world is truly organized to nurture creativity. In our culture, we tend to revere the mental or the visual only, not all the other senses.
Water will always seek the lowest place. Water is the world that we can only see, but we can't live in. The surface of the water separates our world from the world below.
They may be driving by at 40 miles an hour, but they still get that imagery. It's very simple to understand.
Los Angeles is really the crucible or the petri dish in which most of the creative ideas that are really impacting our culture and from here abroad are being grown.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Again, I'm Jim Tripp, your host in the spirit of art, and I hope to see you next week in Art Talk.